many, many times people set up choices for you, like you have to choose A or B. And often you can do both, you can be both. And that there are often opportunities to have multiple identities, still be authentic. It's hard because we want to paint ourselves and other people want to paint us into corners. Are you Indian or are you American?
This is the Indianness podcast, stories of success from leaders and change makers of Indian origin. Why have Indians achieved success across so many different disciplines around the globe? I get asked that all the time. And I answer, I have no idea. But let's find out together because every story is unique. And we have an incredible story with us today. I'm very excited to have Dr. Ashish Jha with us today. Dr. Jha serves as the White House COVID-19 response coordinator from 2022 to 2023. He's also been the Dean of the Brown University School of Public Health since 2020. Dr. Jha is also recognized as one of the leading health policy scholars globally. I invited him on this show as I was very curious about his journey from Parsalia, Bihar, to successfully leading the global fight against COVID. Welcome, Dr. Jha. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on our podcast.
Sanjay, thank you so much for having me here. I'm excited to have a conversation with you.
Wonderful. Ashish, as you know, this is called the Indianness podcast. It's really, we try to do two things on this podcast, and it's hopefully maybe more, but one is capture the stories of change makers like you, because in life, leaders like you are moving at 200 miles an hour and they're always moving forward, thinking forward. So there's very little time to look backward. And sometimes it's very, very important to look backward. And that I think is important for you, but I think it's even more important for people who are going to listen because they get inspired, they learn either from the successes you had, the failures you had, because that's a life journey. So if we can impact even one, two, or more people through this journey, I think it'll be fantastic. We've had tremendous change makers who talk about this journey. And our audience, luckily, is a growing audience of global change makers and other listeners. So in order for us to talk about your journey, let's go right to the beginning. Tell our audience where were you born, and tell them a little bit about your parents, if there were grandparents in the equation or siblings. So let's start with that, Ashish.
Sure. And again, Sanjay, this is, it is rare to get a moment to look backwards and to just look back and reflect. So I am grateful for that opportunity. So thank you for that. I was born in India. As you said, I was born in Parsalia in a village in Bihar. I lived in Patna, the capital city of Bihar, until almost the age of 9. My parents were both education people. I mean, my mom taught at a local college, and my dad worked in the government in the Ministry of Education. Had one older brother. He's 3.5 years older than me. And and I grew up, I think, much the way many Indian kids growing up in Patna in the 70s did. And a couple of other sort of just family things. I remember we would go back and visit my parents' ancestral home. I see my grandparents, my dada and dadi. My mom's parents were still alive then, and we would see them. They lived in Balua, which is a part of Saharsa district of Bihar. And, I had my aunts and uncles and cousins and everything else. It was a very kind of typical family. And then what happened was in the late 1970s, my dad decided that Bihar was a hard place to raise his boys. It was just, he worried about the opportunities. And he did what literally millions of Indians have done, which is he said, I'm going to try to figure out how to get to the West. And applied to dozens and dozens of graduate programs, got into one at the University of Toronto in education, and packed up his bags and with really no money in his pocket, left and came to Toronto. And 6 months later, I was almost 9 years old at that time. My mom and brother and I followed suit. And so I lived in Toronto for a bunch of years, then moved to New Jersey. Again, I could keep going, but that early part of my life obviously both shaped me quite profoundly. I grew up speaking Hindi and Maithili. I didn't speak any English until I arrived in Canada, um, but has always been a really important part of how I see myself as an Indian kid who came to ultimately to America.
So, Ashish, there are a lot of important things you said because everybody is not familiar with Patna and Bihar. Bihar is a very important part of Indian lexicon. Um, how vivid are your memories of, India, Bihar, and Patna?
Pretty vivid. I mean, and again, it probably gets refreshed when I have gone back, right? So there's some of that.
Mhm,
Um, but I remember, I remember playing cricket in front of we lived in an apartment building. I remember playing cricket in front of it. I remember some of my friends, now we're getting into like 40 some odd years ago. So some of the memories are
mhm,
starting to fade a little bit. Um, but I, but more than anything else, Sanjay, I remember how it felt to be there and this deep sense of community, this sense that I was like everybody else there. I didn't feel the kind of otherness that I was struck with when I first came to Canada. I was like, whoa, I'm different than everybody else. I never had that feeling, right? I was like everybody else there. So I would say, as vivid as can be, given that it was a long time.
mhm. Um, Cricket was a part of it. Mom, dad were academics. What was, are there, if you were to pick a couple of things of during the time in Patna that you remember, and grandparents were there,
Yeah,
very close to your grandparents
very close to my grandparents.
on the maternal side or the paternal side?
Both. My grandfather passed away when I was quite young. I think I was 4.
Mm,
So
mm,
my memories of him are much more limited. I mean, I think I have some vague memories of him, unfortunately. Uh, but
mm,
my maternal grandparents, I spent a lot of time with both in India, then also once I moved to the US, they would come and visit,
mm.
spend long periods of time. And my grandmother, on my dad's side, I also remember quite fondly from, again, my early days of being in India.
Mm. And during the school, what kind of school was it when you were in Patna? You were there till the ninth. Any memories
Yeah,
of that?
I do. So it was a private school. Now, if you would ask me the name of the private
Mhm,
school, I probably have forgotten. Um, but it was a private school that I went to. Oh, St. Xavier's, maybe. Um,
uh,
it was one of those,
Possibly.
possibly.
Yeah.
I think so.
Mhm.
And I went
I went to St. Xavier's too, but St. Xavier's is very common.
common name. I think so. I think that's what it was called. And I went there through, basically halfway through second grade, and before leaving. And I don't know. I mean, as I said, it was an English medium school, but I didn't really learn much English at that point. And again, I was 8, 9 years old, so my English skills and knowledge was very, very.
And then suddenly, was it a sudden surprise when Dad says I am off to Canada, and then maybe, but that's a quite a bit of a change. He's gone, and 6 months later, 6 months there is this gap. So, what was? Talk a little bit about what went through with you, and if any of that shaped you, because that's a big change.
It is. What's interesting, Sanjay, and I haven't thought about this in a long time, but so now as I remember it, the idea that I had in my mind, again, this is the idea of an 8-year-old, right? So was that my dad was gone and we always knew we were going to follow him and go too. So once he left, it was a sense that, okay, we were going to come at some point. But I told everyone, and I believe that we were going for 2 years. Why
Mhm.
2 years? I have no idea. In retrospect, I have no idea where that came from, but I used to believe that it was for 2 years. So I remember talking to my friends and saying, oh, I'll be back in 2 years. And it
Mm,
felt like a very dramatic move, but it felt like a very temporary. And so it didn't, I never thought at that time that I would never live in India again, that I would come back and visit,
mm,
but I would never live here again. That was very dramatic. And I think, so it made the transition much easier because I was just going for a couple of years and I didn't really have to say goodbye to people. I could just say, look, I'll see you again soon. Um, but of course, it was a great unknown. I had no idea what I was going to. And none of us did. My brother didn't. My mom didn't. So it was quite a shock when we arrived in Canada uh, in the beginning of March, and it was very, very cold. We didn't have,
cold.
we did not have any clothes to deal with this, and it was quite
But now to Toronto is a little bit, the degrees of temperature difference are pretty significant.
pretty significant, pretty significant. And it was only later that I sort of came to realize. I mean, Patna was again, I have very fond memories. But Bihar still now, though better, but Bihar then was struggling as a state. It had not had any economic development. It really had not had, I mean, the roads, the infrastructure was terrible. There were just a lot of problems with Bihar in the 70s. And again, they continued beyond the 70s. And I think it was only later that I came to appreciate that India was actually much more diverse than just Bihar. For me, Bihar was India, and only later came to realize, oh no, there are parts of India that are actually quite far advanced and quite dynamic. But I was a kid, so what did I know
Mhm. Um, so you, in your mind, somehow it was a 2-year experiment. Did that make it difficult because you thought I'm just a guest here in Toronto? I don't speak English. Maybe I don't need to learn English because I'm going back. Did that make it a little bit harder for you?
It did. It did. And my parents, and again, I have to say, I should talk to my parents about why I thought it was only going to be 2 years. But my parents were very clear. I needed to learn English. I needed to become, I needed to get acclimated and integrated. So they were quite relentless about it. Like even at home, when I would, yeah, of course, I only spoke Hindi at home. And for a little
Mhm.
while, my parents would push me to speak more English. And I was in an English as a second language program and did a lot of that. And I remember thinking, like, do I really need to do this? And they were very, very clear. I really needed to do this. I really needed to learn English. So it's funny. I'm sure that sense of temporariness uh, added to my struggles. But obviously, when you're young and you're in a new place, you can learn things quickly. So I ended up learning English pretty quickly.
But Toronto was must have been a little bit different than what Toronto is now. Not as diverse as obviously right now. It's very diverse. How was Toronto then, Ashish?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was actually in Toronto recently, visiting the University of Toronto. I was invited back I was invited as a visiting professor, and I just walked around a little bit, and some of the memories of my childhood from there really came back. It was remarkable. There weren't that many Indian Americans or Indian Canadians there.
Mhm.
And so I remember that we would be walking down the street, and if you saw someone who looked Indian, you would
Mhm.
cross the street and walk over to them and start talking to them because it was such a joyous moment
Yeah,
of like, oh my God, another Indian person.
yeah,
And those were very rare but wonderful.
mm,
And and that was enough to then say we should get together and we should,
yeah.
there were no Indian grocery stores. There was no like obvious way to. So it was a very different time where you felt very much like I felt very much like we stood out. We were, and it is funny, of course, because now you walk around there and elsewhere, and Indian Americans are everywhere, and they're so it's a very very remarkable thing.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about some inflection points in school. How was school? Did big difference? You were in English medium, St. Xavier's, but didn't know much English.
Yep.
You were in English as a second language. Uh, any struggles there? Friends? Big cricket buff? No cricket anymore?
No cricket anymore. Um, the the one advantage I had, I guess, is I was young. So young kids are flexible, right? So it's
Yeah.
I went
No fear.
no fear and a sense of, I mean, just interesting. The school I went to in Toronto was a public school called Jesse Ketchum Public School. And it was the public school very close to the University of Toronto where all these foreign graduate students sent their kids. So my friends in Toronto were like from all over the world. I remember some of my closest friends, one was from Colombia, one was from Kenya, one was Chinese. And so Jesse Ketchum was this like very unusual melting pot, very unusual because it was international student housing. All those kids were going to Jesse Ketchum School. So who lives in international student housing? It's graduate students from all over the world.
Well,
So in that way, that made the transition so much easier, right? Because even though we were all in this foreign country, we were all struggling with the same issues. And so I had very, very fond memories of Toronto, very fond memories of Jesse Ketchum Public School. As I said, I would go to English as a second language. Of course, because Canada's bilingual, I was supposed to be learning French. Uh, but at least in that first year or so, I got to skip my French class so I could learn English. But then eventually had to start learning French. But I had, it's interesting. I do look back at that time. And again, I was very young at the time, but with a lot of fondness. I think it would have been harder if I went into a place where there were just no immigrants at all. So
mm,
that's the one advantage. Even though there were not a lot of Indian Americans or Indians, there were a
mhm,
lot of people, at least in my local school, from all over the world. And I think that helped.
that helped. Um, was mom, did mom start working also, or it was just dad
No,
working? What
both
was it like?
both of them were graduate students at that time in Toronto. My dad was already when we arrived, and my mom became one because then they were both, so
Mhm.
they both were working towards graduate degrees. And 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 then my older brother was in high school. Oh no, was he in high school already? I guess he might have been in, I don't remember. So he
And he's
came,
3 years
he's
older.
3 years,
He
so he's
came,
12. So he wasn't in high school
yeah,
initially, but then he went on
yeah,
to high school while he was
right.
there. And yeah, and so as I said, I have very fond memories of very nice sort of growing up time at that time.
Mm. Um, do you think moving to the US wasn't a, no, sorry, moving to Canada was an inflection point for you? I mean,
Of course, I mean,
obviously from a journey, but if you could have gone to US or stuff like that, I mean, Toronto uh, as a destination, Ashish.
yeah, Toronto. It's interesting, Sanjay. I mean, obviously, that's where I went, so it's hard to compare what it would have been like if I had gone elsewhere. But I
Mhm,
do think, and I'll talk about the next phase of my time when I was in New Jersey, which was very different and much less
mhm, mhm,
positive. But I think part of what made Toronto an easier transition, a more joyful transition, was that it was a very international city, even then. And again, not a lot of Indians, but a lot of people from over, and certainly in the local community. And I think
mhm,
that allowed me to feel more at home or more comfortable with the transition. And in some ways, I don't think I appreciated how wonderful that was until I moved to New Jersey next. And my parents moved to New Jersey when I was almost 14. We were in Toronto for about 4.5, 5 years.
mhm,
And that was, I think, to me, another real inflection point of feeling much more like an outsider. Sort of ironic because I had already been in Canada for almost 5 years.
mm. So being around a lot of different people, Colombians, Chinese, or, you name it, you were from Patna and had never probably met people from outside Bihar. And then suddenly, so that was, it opened you up for a lot of diverse cultures. Was there pressure at home in terms of academics or anything else at that time, Ashish?
There was, but I would say that came more later.
Okay.
And I was young enough, and I was 10, 12. So at that time, the academic, the rigor. I mean, I don't remember. I no real recollection of grades or anything else. I mean, I think it was very clear to both my brother and I that my parents had made this move for us to get a good education. Like that was always made very clear to us. So that
Mhm.
pressure was always there. But I think in
Okay.
Toronto, I don't know that that was that explicit or necessary to be that explicit.
Okay. So let's talk about the other major move. So what made Dad decide to come to the Garden State of Bruce Springsteen?
Yes. So we moved to New Jersey because my dad finished his graduate studies in Toronto
Mhm.
and then got a job offer with a company that offered
Mhm.
to sponsor him for a green card.
Okay.
And that was all of a sudden an opportunity to stay in the West, right? To stay uh,
Right.
in the US. And so I remember this quite clearly. We packed up everything and we had a small car and we got in the car and drove from Toronto to New Jersey. And and I would say the 4.5, 5 years that I was in New Jersey were probably the hardest 5 years of my life. Just from a kind of a personal and psychological perspective. Um, I'll just get into it because I'm sort of instead
Yeah,
of
please.
uh,
Mhm.
it I arrived in a town, um, which was almost all completely white. That's fine, that's not a problem, but,
Mhm.
it was a town that was not very open or forgiving towards immigrants,
Mhm.
and and I felt immediately just a lot of hostility, in a way I had not experienced in Toronto, because in Toronto, I was one of, like, 50 kids from all around the world, because I went
Mhm.
to a school that happened to be so international. Um, in New Jersey, it was very different. And I remember, so I was in New Jersey 8th grade through high school.
Mhm.
And, there was a small number of Indian students and in my town. And we would get bullied and beat up on it. People would spit on you in the hallways
Oh my God.
and called me names. And it was quite shocking
Mm.
and and quite traumatic. And and my response to it, it was funny because it was a funny. I mean, again, I'm at this point 13, 14, right? So how does a young teenager respond to this? Um, the way I sort of responded to it was I was like, no, I'm going to be very American. I'm just like everybody else. But I'll tell you,
Mm.
Sanjay, that created a sense of conflict that it took me a few years to resolve because I I also felt deeply Indian, but I wanted to be American because I didn't want to
Mm.
stand out. I didn't want to be different, mostly because I
Mm.
didn't want the abuse. Now, I couldn't change my skin color or my name. Um,
Mhm.
so there's an interesting story there, which I'll come back to in a second. Um,
Mhm.
but it was a pretty hostile environment. And I will tell you this story about the name. So in 10th
Mhm.
grade, um, I had a teacher, Mr. Miller, English teacher, who one day walked into class and in front of everybody, I was sitting there, everybody else was sitting there. He walked over to me and he said, "You know what your problem is?" And I looked up, said, "No." And he said, "You have a name that nobody can say. And so you're never going to be successful with that name."
Wow.
I said, "Okay." So, I don't know, 10th grade, 15 years old or something. And he said, "So we need a new name for you." And I've thought about it. And I think you should go with either Bill or Mark. And I said, "Okay." And he said, "Do you want to choose?" And I said, "I just need time to think about it." And he said, "Okay, let me know. And I'll change your name in the classroom and I'll just start calling you that new name whenever you let me know." So what's interesting about that is, first of all, like it is shocking, right?
Yeah.
Um, but a sense that like I think he had in his heart like good intentions. he looked at me and said, "Here's a guy whose name is Ashish, like it's hard to pronounce. No one knows how to spell it. Uh, and and I want to be helpful to him. At least that's the story he told himself.
Hmm.
But in many, many ways, that perfectly captured the place. That the best that they could hope for was I would become just like everybody else and not be different. And the last story out of high school is interesting. It was not a very good high school in the sense that academically, I'd say maybe a third of the students went to any kind of a four-year college. It was not, let's just say, an academic powerhouse. Nobody would go to Ivy League schools or any such thing. And I was the class valedictorian. Now, that is not meant to show off because being valedictorian of this not such a good high school is not some major accomplishment. But to give you a feel for the place, a group of parents got together and petitioned the principal to take my class valedictorian status away. And their argument was he doesn't look like what our valedictorian should look like. And so he should not be class valedictorian because of class valedictorian gives a
Unbelievable.
speech. So that was a hard time of my life in a way that I think I only appreciated later. I mean, it was just deeply racist. And this is the late 80s in New Jersey.
Yeah.
Um, and so I'm happy to talk more about it, but moving on to college was this like just this breath of fresh air. It was wonderful. Uh, but
But
in
Ashish, can we just go back to
yeah,
that time? Because
please.
firstly, to be honest with you, it is stunning because you're not talking about the 40s, 50s, or 60s here, man. You're
Yeah.
talking about late 80s.
Yep.
Uh, and New Jersey, okay. Uh, what about your brother? Did he ever go through something like this? Was he in the same school?
My brother was in
And
the.
did he know what you were going through, or did your parents know what you were going through?
Those are good
Or you
questions.
were just a tough kid, didn't want to bother anybody?
No, so my brother went to school there for 1 year. Um, and then he had enough credits from his school in Toronto that he was able to leave and go to college early. So my
Oh,
brother was only there for like a year, year and a half in the school system before he went off to college. I didn't talk to my parents about any of this. I felt like they had enough.
nothing. You didn't even tell them anything about this, that they wanted to take you, not have you be the valedictorian.
I think they knew a little bit about that. They got some sense that something had happened. Sanjay, it's funny as I'm speaking to you, I'm thinking about the fact that once this podcast is over, I'm going to send them a link to this podcast, of course, and they may find some of this stuff out for the first time. I don't think I've ever talked to them about some of these things. I
Wow.
it was hard, and I was in some ways ashamed of it. I was ashamed of being different, ashamed of feeling, it's just that kind of very overt racism. It's very psychologically difficult, and so I really didn't tell anybody about it. It took me years to just sort of both acknowledge it, understand it for what it was, um, and realize it had nothing to do with me. It had to do with the people who were there, and that. Uh, but yeah, I
And
don't think I've ever talked about.
how has it impacted you? I mean, because remember, these are learning moments because there are potentially others who are listening who are either going through this or not. How did it impact you? And obviously, you come out on the right side of it because you're an academic yourself. I mean, and stunning to see that something like this happens in an academic institution.
Yeah.
But you were what, 15, 16 at that time?
Yeah, I mean, but high school, 15 through 18, right? And
Yeah.
um,
Any friends there at all?
yeah, I had some friends, couple of good
Mainly Indian
friends.
kids?
No, there were only a few Indian kids, a couple of African American kids. It was, let's say, probably about 90% Caucasian.
Hmm.
Uh, I had a few good friends, actually several good friends, including one or two people I still keep in touch with. But I don't even know how much I talked to them about it. I mean, they saw some of it. They didn't see all of it. But I largely kept it to myself because I was embarrassed. I didn't want to be different. I wanted to be like everybody else. And of course, like part of me, if I could go back and give myself, my 14-year-old self advice, now it's hard to do this when you're 14, but I would say that it's important to have the courage to be yourself, to not be ashamed of who you are, and to have the courage to say, no, my name is not Mark or Bill, it's Ashish. Like that is my name. And if that's hard for you, I'm sorry that's hard for you, but that is my name. Um, and I did not have the courage at the time to do that. Uh, and I wish I had.
Uh, Several questions. I mean, this is stunning. Did you change your name there?
Nope.
Did you pick Bill or Mark?
Nope. I came back a couple of days later and I told him that I just wanted to keep my name as it was. I
It's a
guess
great
that's
name,
good.
by the way. Yeah,
Look,
that was pretty good.
it's
That
the
was
only
pretty
name I've
good.
had, and I'm very happy with it.
Yeah. So those were some pretty traumatic years, Ashish. Um, and do you think it has shaped some of how you think, how you operate? In what way has it shaped you?
It very much has, Sanjay. And I'm actually thinking about this now in some ways for the first time, because I said I haven't had a chance to reflect on this. So the story, I'll tell you the next part of the story only because I think it helps answer your question. So
Mhm,
after high school, I go to college. I went to Columbia in New York
mhm,
City. And early on in my time at Columbia, I meet this guy named Michael Paley, who's a rabbi, Rabbi Michael Paley.
mhm,
And he is the university chaplain, head of the religious kind of programs at Columbia. And I become very close
mhm,
to him. And I start talking to him about some of these things.
mhm.
And I mean, it's the ultimate irony of America that an Indian American kid who struggles with the racism finds a Jewish rabbi to help him understand and process it. But Michael Paley was wonderful. And one of the things he taught me early was that there was no contradiction between being American and being Indian. That that in fact, I could embrace everything I loved about being Indian, about who my parents were, about who I was, about what kind of food I liked, about my name. I could embrace all of those things and still be American. Like, because I always thought I had to choose between the two. And I didn't want to choose because I didn't want to give up who I was. But then I thought if I stay and identify as an Indian, I'm going to get like abused and harassed and I'll never really fit in. And I was 18 and
Mhm.
19 and I wanted to fit in. And Michael Paley was the first person who taught me that you don't have to choose. And that, by the way, now we're talking about something very personal and certainly about my identity, but that has been a really important lesson that has been a thread throughout my entire life. That many, many times people set up choices for you, like you have to choose A or B. And often you can do both, you can be both. And that there are often opportunities to have multiple identities, still be authentic. Um, it's hard because we want to paint ourselves and other people want to paint us into corners. Are you Indian or are you American? How about both? I feel
Well,
very American, but I
yeah,
also feel very deeply Indian. And like, why is that a problem? Right? Who said it's a problem? Who gets to decide? No one gets to decide. I get to decide.
yeah, yeah. So Michael Paley really was a big help. Um, the move to Colombia, was that your choice? Is that the one that you picked? How did you decide? Was that another inflection point going to Colombia?
Absolutely. The way that happened was, again, this is very classic of the Indian American kid whose parents, of course, in high school, very focused on my grades, very focused on.
Mhm,
But again, as I said, I was not in a particularly good high school. I applied to basically all the top colleges,
mhm,
and Columbia was the best college I got into. And I was a great college, a great place. So,
yeah.
no regrets, of course. But I applied to all the top Ivy League schools, et cetera. And it's funny, I tell people here at Brown, I jokingly remind them that I got rejected by Brown when I was 18. And, but you know, and my parents didn't really know
And
how to advise me.
maybe by Harvard too, Ashish.
Yes, I did. And so I spent 15 or 16 years teaching Harvard undergrads, and I would tell
That's
them.
what I'm saying.
And part of it was, my parents didn't know how to advise me. My high school counselor had never advised somebody who had gone to a top school. So it was not really a high school designed for. And so I feel like I was very fortunate to get into Columbia. I don't know how I got in, but I did. I was very, very fortunate. And then, that was probably in some ways the biggest inflection point. I mean, maybe coming from India to Canada, but the second
Yeah.
big one really was Colombia, because it was liberating. It was freeing. It was all of a sudden like, oh, I can learn things. I can be myself. It really is a place I have a lot of very, very fond feelings for.
So you think you came into your own at Columbia, Ashish?
Yeah, in many ways. I it was
You,
hard.
what was it? You were doing econ there?
Yeah, it was hard. I mean, in the sense that I came in not knowing what to do.
Mm.
And I took a class my freshman year um, from a guy named Sunil Gulati. And
Yep.
he was
And by the
just,
way, didn't he end up running the soccer?
yes, he did.
Yeah, I
Yes,
know.
he did.
Yeah.
And during the pandemic a couple of years ago, I sent him a note saying how much he influenced my life. And he wrote me back a lovely note, but he taught me Econ 101, and I just loved it. I just loved the way that economists thought about the world. Now, again, I was 18, but it was fantastic. But
Mm.
I will say the other part of this is, my parents, particularly my mother, and she will deny this, but it is completely true. My mother was very, very, very clear. She wanted one of her two sons to be a doctor. And my older brother had no interest whatsoever. So it was either me or nobody.
Nobody.
And my dad was much more like, you should do whatever you want and you can be successful.
Yeah.
And my mother was like, you can do anything you want as long as you're a doctor.
Got it.
And and of course she denies this now, says, no, I never told you
Of
this was
course.
your decision.
Yeah.
Of course, mommy, that's right. But she has conveniently forgotten this part of the story. So she was very strong on that. So I was also a pre-med.
Mm.
And then Columbia was great. And I was trying to decide between graduate school in economics. I was an economics major, and medical school. And I applied to medical school. And again, I feel very fortunate. I got into Harvard Medical School. And in some ways, the decision was done. Like, I was not going to get a chance to say no to my parents, people who had come from India. I am not going to go to Harvard Medical School. Like, that was their dream.
Yeah.
And so I, packed up my bags from Columbia and went up to Boston. I tell people this now. I probably went for the wrong reasons. I went because it was a great school and my mom told me I needed to be a doctor. The good news was I arrived there and very quickly fell in love with medicine and have always loved being a medical student, a doctor. So maybe she knew something about me that I didn't know. But I will always say I went because my mother made me go to medical school.
We on the show, Ashish, we call it the two profession rule that Indians have: doctor or engineer. And the
Exactly.
two grade rule that Indians have: A plus or A. There's no other
Exactly.
grade that is acceptable.
Exactly.
So from Columbia, you went to Harvard. How was, I mean, Columbia, you came into your own
Yep.
econ and other classes, etc. How was the experience at Harvard? Another inflection point, you think, going into medicine?
Yeah, I'll tell you what I loved about medicine, still love about medicine, and why am so happy I did, and I'm thankful to my parents, is it gave me some deeply practical skills, right? Yes, it's a lot of studying and a lot of learning, but the application, its utility becomes very clear very quickly because everybody around you has health problems. This is something that everybody encounters. If you become an economist, most people don't walk around saying, what is the impact of trade policy going to be on GDP growth, right? Like most people don't care about that, but everybody has health questions. Everybody has. And so I came to realize two things. One was medicine was fantastic as a very practical tool for helping people. But the second was that I really enjoyed being very practical and uh, very focused on impact in a way that just being kind of an academic and writing great papers or thinking about the world in a more kind of general way was not so interesting to me. It was much more. I was much more interested in how is this going to move the needle on something that's important. And that was something I learned in medical school for the first time. Because in college, I was learning all these kind of interesting things, but what is the application of it? It's not so clear. Medical school was the first time I came to realize, oh yeah, knowledge really can be used for action.
Knowledge can be used for action. And you fell in love with medicine. And then once your medical degree was done, then you stayed in academics. Why, Ashish?
Yeah, I will tell you, Sanjay, and maybe this is a point that I think may resonate with listeners and certainly for young people, a point worth understanding. I have described myself as a reluctant academic. And yet, here I am 20 years after I finished training and I'm still in academia. So you can ask the question, how reluctant are you? But even in the early days of I finished residency, finished fellowship, and was thinking about starting an academic job as an assistant professor at Harvard. And I remember telling my mentor, Arnie Epstein, wonderful, wonderful guy. I remember saying to him, I don't think I'm going to stay in academia very long. And he said, why not? And I said, I just feel like so much of academic work doesn't really make a difference. I want to make a difference in the world. And he said to me, well, if your problem with academia is that so much academic work doesn't make any difference in the world, then make sure that your work does. Like make sure you focus on doing work that's impactful and practical. And that was very much a guiding principle in my research, in my teaching, but primarily my research was I was very, very focused on doing research, health policy, on healthcare delivery, that I could see practical implications and applications. It had me spending a lot of time in Washington because I was working on health policy issues. And of course, Washington was the place where a lot of those policies were getting written and implemented. Had me spending a lot of time with policymakers. And this is where that duality thing comes in. Because a lot of people would say to me, well, are you a policy person or are you an academic? And I was like, why can't I be both?
Both.
And that kind of issue has come up over and over again where people have often said to me, are you this or are you that? And I'm like, what if I'm both?
It's the rabbi's message to you.
It's the rabbi's message to me. And it has served me. I think it has served me very well. Certainly it has made my life a very happy one for me in that way, because again, academia is great, but I know I would not have been happy if I had just stayed a pure academic, writing papers, getting grants, but not being out there in the world, engaging with people.
So you've been at Brown. Any inflection points there? I have a feeling there are a couple more that brought you again to Washington. So tell our listeners a little bit, because again, remember, there are young people listening. You've talked about the duality, the choices you make, accepting who you are, the academic part, and sometimes reluctantly following what your mother tells you.
Yes.
So any other inflection points?
Yeah, I will say a couple of things. So throughout my career, back in 2016, I was at Harvard, and 2015, 2016, there was a big outbreak of Ebola in West Africa. And the global response to it went very badly. And there's a link to this story here in a second. And I co-chaired with a colleague in the UK, an international commission that looked at why did things go so badly and how do we do better in responding to infectious disease outbreaks. And in that work, we wrote up a report, which I presented to WHO and to other people. And I got to meet a guy named Ron Klain. And Ron was the Ebola czar for President Obama at that time.
Right.
And so he saw my piece, he saw me speaking about it, and he called me up and said, we should talk. And that was a relationship that I maintained, not because I thought someday it will pay off for me, but Ron was this wonderful, brilliant person. And one of the lessons I have learned over the years, because I'll tell you what happened next, one of the lessons I've learned is, when you build relationships, you have to nurture them and keep them in your life. Without a desire to say, how will this pay off for me? I had no idea whether my relationship with Ron would have any impact in the future. But Ron became the chief of staff to Joe Biden when Joe Biden became president.
Mhm.
And in that role, Ron and I would continue speaking about COVID. And then that led to, and I'll just tell you the story of how I came into the White House job. It was actually quite an extraordinary story. In February of 22, Ron called me one day and we had a long conversation. And then he asked me at the end, he said, would you consider coming into government? And I said, Ron, this country has given me so much, has given me everything, that I would do that if I could be useful to the country. If you or the president thought I could be helpful to this country, I would do that in a heartbeat. And 2 weeks later, I was sitting in the White House next to the president of the United States, interviewing for the job. And we had this incredible conversation. He asked me about where I grew up. He asked me about growing up in India and some of the same questions you're asking, Joe Biden was asking. And I talked to him about my life and what I had thought. He asked me about COVID and what was going well, what was going badly. And then about halfway through the conversation, he puts his hand on my arm. We're sitting right next to each other. He puts his hand on my arm. And he says, doctor, I would love for you to come work in my administration. I need you here. The country needs you here. Would you come? When the president of the United States does that, I said to him, I said, sir, it would be the honor of a lifetime. Of course. And and then I remember talking to my parents about it. And I'll just say one more quick thing on this. For 18 months, almost 18 months, every morning, I walked through the north gate of the White House and walked down to my office in the West Wing. And every morning I just thought, this is crazy. Like, here's this Indian kid from Patna, who the high school teacher said, you have to change your name because you'll never make it if your name is Ashish. Walking into the West Wing to go to my office. I mean, talk about just this incredible privilege and a sense that this is almost out of a movie. It doesn't happen in normal life. But it does happen. And it can happen. And of course, I feel very, very fortunate and blessed that these kinds of opportunities have come up. But it is a uniquely American story.
It says a lot about this country, and it says a lot about you. Ashish, a few lessons that you mentioned. One is relationships matter. This is again for our listeners, young listeners especially. As you said, building relationships with no clear, objective or aim per se that something's going to pay off. I think that was. And sometimes when your name is called, raising your hand and standing up. Sometimes it's for the country. Everybody is not asked for the country, but it could be in your company. It could be for anything else.
Absolutely.
So just rise to the challenges. Please add something to that, Ashish.
Yeah, look, two things on the relationship front. People often talk about networking and building a long list of contacts. And I always say to people, it's not about contacts. It's not about your network. It's about relationships. And relationships are not transactional, right? I think about my relationship with my brother or my parents. It's not, I do this for you, you do this for me. That's not a relationship. And in the long run, that's what enriches our lives, but also has payoffs for people. people, and you don't know when it's going to come, and you can't worry about that. This is a very Indian way of thinking about the idea that you do your karma because it's the thing to do, and you
Yeah.
don't spend all your time worrying about when am I going to get my fruits from my actions. Um, and then on the service part, I now say this to everybody: there will always come a moment when you have the opportunity to serve others. It can be for the country, it can be for your city, it can be for your school, it can be wherever. When those opportunities come, if you can possibly find it in yourself to say yes, you should, because the benefits are not to the people you serve. The benefits are to you. It enriches you in a way you cannot possibly see when you begin that journey. I think having service as a part of what you do in your life is one of the most enriching things I've certainly been through. And I encourage it for people as a way to enrich themselves.
Ashish, there's a lot more I need to ask, but I do want to recognize that we have a deadline. I'm going to just ask you two quick questions. We need to get you back because there's so many questions I had. I'm going to take 30 seconds because I promised to get you out of here. One is a quick definition of Indianness, because we asked that to our guests. It means different things to different people.
Quick definition of Indianness.
Mhm.
Look, I think there are things that are uniquely Indian in our culture that that shape all of us who come from an Indian background. For me, Indianness has been about service. It has been about doing your work and not focus on the outcomes. It is about embracing duality in a way that other people don't think is possible. Those are three elements that I think have been critical to my life, certainly, and they all come from my Indian background.
Fantastic. Last one word answer. The one person who's been the most influential in your journey. One.
Can it be in my family, or
I
does
have,
it be outside of my family?
well, it can be your family.
I have to say my father.
I
Uh,
knew that.
my father, love my mother. Hope she doesn't get mad when I say this, but he is the one person who always told me to focus on doing what's right, no matter how hard it is, no matter who you upset. Focus on doing what's right, and things pay off.
Well, I, I'm sure he's very, very proud of you. And I'm sure when he gets to listen to this, he's going to be more proud. Ashish, it's been such a pleasure. I'm sure our guests, our listeners are going to get some incredible stories. We need to have you back here because there are so many other messages that you have in your inspirational journey. So thanks for taking the time from your very, very busy schedule. And thanks for what you have done for the country and the world and what you're currently doing. So thank you for being on the Indianness podcast.
Sanjay, thank you. And I'm happy to come back if that would be helpful. But thank you for this wonderful conversation.
Thank you.